Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Bildner Center's first mini course of the spring 2021 semester. I'm Nancy Sinkoff. I'm the academic director of the Alan and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life, professor of Jewish Studies and History here at Rutgers, and I actually work on Polish Jewry, so tonight's mini course is of special interest to me. I'm so delighted to, quote, see so many of you, and particularly delighted to welcome our guest. Let me give you the ground rules before I do the formal introduction. This is a webinar format. I think we're all used to this now. All of you are muted. If you want to ask a question, please feel free to use the chat function, which is at the bottom of your screen. I will be moderating the chat. That means during the course, I will be looking at the chat and I will compile the questions to pose to Professor Deckelhen when he finishes his teaching session. So don't be shy, please ask your questions. I'd like you to know that the mini course is being recorded, so if you come in late or have to miss part of a section, you will have the opportunity to catch up and your attendance will not be noted. You won't get a demerit for it. Please also note that we are recording this with closed captions, which will allow a variety of people to have access to the course. You should know that foreign words, if they appear in Professor Deckelhen's oral presentation, often get garbled in closed captions. So forgive us for that. That's just what happens with foreign vocabulary. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce a friend and a colleague, Professor Jonathan Deckelhen. Professor Deckelhen is the Alan and Joan Bildner Visiting Scholar for the Spring 2021. He holds the Rabbi Edward Sandro Chair in Soviet and East European Jewry at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Professor Deckelhen has a wide range of scholarly interests, including agrarian history, Soviet Jewish history, anti-Jewish violence, and migration. He has authored a very important book entitled Farming the Red Land, Jewish Agricultural Colonization and Local Soviet Power, 1923 to 1941, which is published in 2005. And he is editor with Eugene M. Fruton and Robert Weinberg of an edited volume called Ritual Murder in Russia, Eastern Europe and Beyond, New Histories of an Old Accusation. Professor Deckelhen also is involved, I will tell you it's not on his official CV, but was supporting local artists in Israel. Underprivileged youths who are musically talented are able to go to a music school that he helped establish. Here at the Bildner Center, although everything is virtual, as you know, he will be not only teaching this mini course, he will be giving 2 faculty seminars in his fields of research, and he will be working to produce an online exhibition on Jewish agriculture in New Jersey. So we are deeply honored to have him as a visitor. We wish we could spend more time with him in situ, but I'm looking forward with you to learning from Professor Deckelhen in these next 3 sessions. Thank you very much. Just to remind you, today is session 1 of a course called Tevye's Descendants, a short history of Soviet Jewry. And today's session is called Tevye and His Times, from the rule of the Tsars to the Commissars, 1773 to 1921. I hand it over to you, Professor.
Well, thank you very much, Nancy, and good evening to everyone. It's a privilege to be able to offer this mini course at Rutgers. What am I going to try to do this evening? It's not possible to cover everything that there is to know, of course, about Russian and then Soviet Jewry. What I'm going to try to do is to give you a picture of the richness of that community, the changes, the triumphs, and the tragedies. For those of you who are interested in more detail, that's the reason that I offered to you, and I believe that you received the links by way of email, to the YIVO Encyclopedia of the Jews of Russia and Eastern Europe, which for the last few years has served as by far the best resource for anyone who would like to learn more down to granular detail. So I more than invite you to seek their answers to your questions, far more than I would ever be able to relay to you in this course or a full university course for that matter. It's available in print, but more importantly, it's available completely for free online. Why did I choose this title for the course, Tevye and his Descendants? Well, for most of us, and it was true for me as well, growing up as a child and a young man in Connecticut, the images that most of us have about that past, no matter where we came from, were formed by something similar to Tevye and Fiddle Around the Roof and what seemed to be a Jewish reality that we either saw on stage with Zero Mostel, or as you could see in the opening slide with Chaim Topol on the screen, or the music. Tevye began actually as a literary figure, as Tevye the dairyman or Tevye the milkman in stories by Shalom Aleichem in the late 19th century. We'll get to Shalom Aleichem a little bit as we move further on in class today. But it's important to keep in mind that Tevye, in all of his forms, literary, on stage, and later on in film, was a fictional character. But that fiction helped to form, for most of us, our ideas about what was really going on for your average Russian Jew, certainly before the revolutions of 1917. And certainly for all people who have a communal identity, there's always going to be a tension between collective memories, personal memories, artistic representations of that past and reality. In the case of Jews, it seems to me that that tension is really exacerbated by mass migration. We are wanderers, mass migrations, collective tragedies, some of which I'll touch upon here, that were pertinent to Russian and then Soviet Jewry. And in 1948, the rebirth of a nation state in Israel that somehow or another had to make sense of that history, both its tragedies and its triumphs. We have a lot of work ahead of us in the next 3 sessions, trying to figure out the connections, the balance between facts and those memories that most of us have with us. So to start all of this, I'd like to get some basic dates straight, because it can be terribly confusing, I know, even for professional historians. I think these dates will help us situate a little bit better these questions about East Europe, Russia, Soviet Union. So Karen, please go to the first slide. And here before us, we have a very colorful map. I know it can be a little bit much on the eyes, but I'd like to explain a little bit where Russian Jewry comes from with the help of this map. In fact, in the Russian Empire that we see before us, and as you can see by the many, many colors and the legend that we see on the upper left, the Russian Empire expanded over time. It started out very, very small around the city of Kiev and then grew over time. Russia had no Jews, or almost no Jews, until the year 1772, 1773. And over the course of the next 20 or so years, Russia arrives, or Russia absorbs Jews. Where are these Jews coming from? They're not actually moving at all. Rather, as you can see in the burnt orange area on the left, on the west of this map, Russia annexes a great deal of what was once the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, or in short, the Kingdom of Poland. It not just absorbs territory, but an awful lot of Jews. So in fact, Russia has swallowed Jews, Polish Jews, by and large, without actually moving these Jews at all. So there are now, as of 1772, certainly 1795, there are about 400,000 Jews in the Russian Empire who weren't there before, and they all, again, are swallowed up very, very quickly. The next important date, so we have Russian Jews. The next important date for figuring out the terminology here is 1917. In 1917, we'll touch upon this more later on in our class today. In 1917, that Russian Empire disintegrates. It disintegrates as a result of 2 revolutions, one of which, and the most successful of them and the more permanent, is the Bolshevik Revolution. From the Russian Empire emerges Soviet Russia. So most of these very same Jews they are descendants of what were once Polish Jews, now Russian Jews, and as of 1917, October of 1917, they become Soviet Jews, Soviet Jews. The next critical date for all this terminology comes in 1991. 1991. So in living memory, I would assume almost everyone today in class, in 1991, this grand Soviet Union that goes from the borders of Poland all the way to the Pacific Ocean, the Soviet Union disintegrates. And as a result, all of these millions of Jews who until that moment, from 1917 to 1991, were Soviet Jews are transformed without moving again. They didn't move anywhere, are transformed into post-Soviet Jews, citizens of other countries, most of which we see on this map in front of us. And that's from the 16th, 17th, 19th century, sort of back to the future. So we have millions of Jews going almost nowhere, yet changing their citizenship over the course of a couple of hundred years. Now, there's a big question, and it's a question that concerns not just me, but universities and perhaps you as well. After all, why should one really be all that interested in Russian Jewry today? I mean, we're talking about millions that once lived in this space. But today, if we take all of this space that's still on the map in front of us, you might get liberally to perhaps 500,000 Jews in all of the space of the former Soviet Union. But that hides a much more important fact, because in 1915, sort of at the edge of where we're going today in our lesson, the world Jewish population was about 14 million people. Now, if that's the case, that means that in 1915, 5 million Jews were still living in the Russian Empire, which would be slightly more than 1/3 of all Jews. But then if you add onto those 5 million Jews living in the Russian Empire, another 2 or 3 million who had emigrated from the Russian Empire in 20, 30 years before that, we get to nearly 7 million Jews who are Russian speakers coming from that tradition. And in fact, many Jews, both in Israel and many other parts of the Jewish diaspora today, certainly in Israel, are descendants of those Russian or Soviet Jews that we're going to be talking about today. It's important, though, not only in terms of demography. Where do we come from? What were our roots? What's our DNA? It's also part of our ideological DNA, because the ideologies generated by Russian Jews, Russian and then Soviet Jews that we'll be talking about, became over time the cornerstones of Jewish life everywhere, from the mid-19th century until at least the middle of the 20th century. Even if these Russian and then Soviet Jews couldn't always act upon these ideologies. And in fact, most of these ideologies are still core to my homeland, Israel. If Russia, and this is a crazy sort of approach to this question, had Russia never been repressive, because most of us from Tevye and other stories know that Russia and the Soviet Union was repressive towards Jews, and that's true. But had they not been repressive towards Jews, there would have been no Zionist movement to speak of, no early pioneers to the land of Israel, no, or much smaller Jewish communities pretty much everywhere else in the world. And the Jewish world as a whole would have developed on a very different trajectory. So this history of Russian Jews and Soviet Jews is important both looking back, but also in the present. Because even if in the former Soviet Union, there are no more, and again, it's very liberal to say there are 500,000 Jews still living in all of this vast territory, the issue of Jews in this space still burns in all of these successor countries after the Soviet Union broke up. It still burns both in Russia itself, in independent Ukraine, in Latvia, in Lithuania, and almost all of the others, for reasons that we'll touch upon in week 3. Secondly, inside of Israel, for those of you who are a little bit more keyed into it, Jews from the former Soviet Union still inhabit a pivotal voting bloc in Israeli parliamentary politics. it's very difficult to be prime minister in Israel if you don't have fairly widespread support amongst Russian-speaking Jews. In Israel, the United States, and in Germany today, there are substantial Russian-speaking Jewish communities. And all of these communities, although we may not be terribly aware of them or connected to them in terms of the older veteran Jewish populations, really must account for these new diasporas within the Jewish world. And finally, this new Russian-speaking diaspora has become a kind of transnational cultural, business, and even political network all over the world, wherever there is this new Russian-speaking diaspora. So all of these things really encourage us to not only look upon these questions looking backward, but also looking at ourselves today and certainly moving forward. And now we're going to go backwards in time. Next slide, please. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Go back. My mistake. Go back, please. Great. Now, you can see on this map that there are 3 circles in sort of the left half of the map. And this is going to be a kind of cluing us in to where the Jews have lived in the Russian Empire and later on in the Soviet Empire. The largest circle in sort of the middle left is what we will call right now the area of the Pale of Settlement. I'll explain that a little bit more later on. And that is the place where Russia absorbed the Ashkenazi Jewish population from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Again, last part of the 18th century. But there are 2 other circles. And here we see, or we're going to get a taste of very different kinds of Jews, because we have the one lower just around Azerbaijan, and those communities are what we call mountain Jews. They inhabit the Caucasus region, and they were there well before Ashkenazi Jews ever came or were included into the Russian Empire. And further down around Samarkand and Tashkent and Bukhara, we see the area of the Principality of Bukhara, and there we have the Bukharian Jews. And now we can go to the next slide. I mean, we have an image of what Tevye's world looked like, and we'll look at it a little bit further on. But I wanted to give you a little bit of a taste about what that other world looked like. And there are going to be a series of pictures now taken during ethnographic studies by the Russian Jewish community in these parts of what was then the Russian Empire, to learn about and document the lives of these Sephardic Jews living in the mountains of the Caucasus. Next slide, please. And here we see in Central Asia, again, around the same time, 1910. And finally, the last slide, or the next slide. Next slide, please. And here we see Krimchak families, and this may come as more of a surprise. The Krimchaks were a small group. No, go back, please. No, you've gotten ahead. Back. Go back, please, to the Krimchaks. Thank you. Stay there. No, yes, stop. Thank you. The Krimchaks were an even smaller community. If the Caucasus Jews numbered in the high tens of thousands, the Bukharians in the mid tens of thousands, the Krimchaks, who are Jews who were separated for the most part through their wanderings from Bavel and other places from the main Jewish Ashkenazi community. They inhabited, as you can see from the slide, a part of the Crimean Peninsula and lived very Jewish lives, but in great disconnection from the majority of the Jewish world. It survived, and to a degree also thrived in the Crimean Peninsula until they were massacred by the German army during the Second World War. So here again, we see lives that are very unlike those that we might have imagined through Fiddler on the Roof. Overall, there was very little contact between Jews and the Russian Empire until the absorption of those Polish territories in the late 1700s. Once those territories were absorbed, however, tensions very, very quickly were ignited between Jews, their non-Jewish neighbors, as well as non-Jews that those new arrivals into the Russian Empire were meeting, mainly in the world of commerce, because most of these Jews, most of these Polish Jews who are now Russian Jews, their jobs were in commerce, and they came into a great deal of friction with non-Jews in their area and non-Jews further into the Russian Empire. These frictions exploded in 1799 into the first pogroms in the Russian Empire, around what today is Belorussia. The Tsar at the time, Alexander I, or Alexander the Great, as it became known later on, was very concerned by these pogroms and sent out an investigative committee to see what's to be done now once the pogroms had been, once those pogroms had been sort of beaten down by the Russian army. The answer to that question, what is to be done, was the statute, the Tsars statute of 1804. And that also you have in your hands, the Tsars statute of 1804, which in fact is the first attempt by the Russian Empire to really try and think about what's to be done with these Jews. There's about 500,000 of them, and it's clear that the tensions and the frictions between these Jews and their non-Jewish neighbors are going to ignite sooner or later. And every Russian ruler has known now for hundreds of years that once violence starts, popular violence starts in the Russian Empire, it may start around a given conflict, but eventually, if not restricted and not put down, that popular violence can threaten the regime itself. Now, if that's the case, what in fact does the statute of 1804 suggest? Well, it's a long document, as you, for those of you who have read it, can see. I would say the main thrust, and it is a fascinating document. It's on the one hand restrictive. It's really talking about what professions Jews should be working in and what professions they should not be working in. An attempt to separate, not physically separate, but separate professions between Jews and non-Jews, to limit those frictions on the one hand. Also to limit them, to begin limiting them in space, so that Jewish merchants can't go too far afield from that area that was absorbed into the Russian Empire, in order not to create further conflicts and to be unwanted competition to the non-Jewish Russian merchants. So that's one side of the statute of 1804, which I guess most of us could have guessed. But the other more surprising side of that statute is that the Tsar approves the recommendations in the statute, which in fact offer education to Jews, offer them a kind of acceptance into Russian administration, attempts to make them, for their own protection, attempts to make them more Russian in a lot of ways. And perhaps the most surprising to all of us, and here I'd like you to go to the next slide, please. Perhaps the most extraordinary thing that happens in 1804 in that same statute, that the Tsar opens up an entire area of the Russian Empire newly conquered from the Turks to Jewish agricultural settlement. And on the map on the left, we see the European part of the Russian Empire, and we can see a blue circle. That area around the city of Odessa and Kherson, just above the Crimean Peninsula, becomes the area that the Tsar allows and in fact encourages Jewish agricultural settlement. The first colonies, and this is pretty much empty land, empty but extremely fertile farmland, and it remains to this day the most fertile part of Russia and Ukraine. And as of 1807, there are the beginnings of Jewish agricultural colonization in this part, what will become the breadbasket of Russia. And I give a couple of examples here in the map in the middle in white. I have a red circle, and there we see 2 or 3 of the colonies, but all of those blue dots are Jewish colonies that are created in the first half of the 1800s with amazing names like Sde Menucha. For those of you who don't know Yiddish or Hebrew, that means fields of rest. And there are 2, one next to each other. One is the large Sde Menucha, and then the other one is the small Sde Menucha. But there are other colonies around with Hebrew or Yiddish names. And these colonies at first will have a very difficult time because they're totally unplanned. And there's a lot of suffering there, mainly from neglect for the first few decades. But these colonies will, in fact, get strengthened over time, and they will survive and thrive until the Second World War, which, of course, as we can imagine, is really going to be a watershed year in the fate of Russian and then Soviet Jews. We have 2 other photos there, and these are vintage photographs. The bottom one of the village itself was probably taken in the 1910s. The photograph of the colonists themselves was taken in the 1920s. And 1920s and 1930s. And these colonies were so successful, in fact, that they became kind of models for Russian and Soviet agriculture thereafter. So there are good pieces of news here. However, with every good piece of news in the history of Jews in Russia and Soviet Union, as we'll find over the next 3 weeks, there's usually some bad news as well. And if we can move to the next slide, please. The next piece of bad news will come in 1835. 1835, when this area, this geographic area that the Statute of 1804 had begun restricting Jews to, becomes codified. It becomes law. From 1835, Jews are only legally allowed to live in a part of the Russian Empire called the Pale of Settlement, which more or less mimics the places that they already live when Poland, or that this part of Poland, was absorbed into the Russian Empire. And it is illegal, except for exceptional Jews, to exit or even to stay overnight outside of this geographic area. This Pale of Settlement will remain in force until the empire falls in 1917. And this restriction makes it all the more difficult for Jews to be economically viable. Because if most of your livelihood is going to be based on commerce and light industry, it's going to be extremely difficult if you can only market within or travel yourself within this relatively confined area that's going to become increasingly overcrowded with time. And we'll talk more about that later on, this overcrowding and what it does. Again, at the birth of Russian Jewry, we're talking about 400, maybe 500,000 Jews in this area of several million. But over time, these proportions will change. It is important, however, to keep in mind that if we're talking about 1804 or 1835 or things that'll happen a little bit later on, one thing that the Jews are not in the Russian Empire, and that is serfs. Russia, the Russian Empire, is comprised mainly of serfs, meaning partially enslaved people, all of whom are Christian. The Jews as non-Christians, as non-Orthodox, were not enserfed, meaning that they were free people, but confined geographically to this space. As difficult as that was, at least until the emancipation of Russian serfs in 1861, Russia's Jews were, at the very least, on a better standing than the vast majority of Russian subjects at that time. And without getting too bogged down into the details, there are some big events that we're going to account for, and also to understand the building blocks of what will become Soviet Jewry. we pick up the chronology around the time of the reign of Tsar Nicholas I. Next slide, please, which is roughly the second quarter of the 1800s. So from 1825 until 1854. Now, in popular Jewish memory, and you can see Tsar Nicholas, he's farthest on the left. You can see Tsar Nicholas on the left. In popular Jewish memory, certainly amongst older folks, and even today amongst the ultra-Orthodox communities in Israel, the United States, and elsewhere, his rule is remembered with special pain. Because according to these stories, the Tsarist army under his order kidnapped huge numbers of young Jewish boys from their hometowns and pressed them into service in the Imperial Russian army. And as a result of that, forced them to convert from Judaism to Russian Orthodoxy. That's the story. What's the history behind this? In fact, from 1827, Jewish communities throughout the Russian Empire, again, almost all of them in the Pale of Settlement, were required to send a total of approximately 1,500 young men to Imperial Army service every year. Now, Imperial Army service was kind of a death sentence in the Russian Empire because it was mandatory 25 years. So whoever you were, once you sent your son to military service, chances were you were never going to see him again because they were usually stationed far from home. The general age for conscription for Russian conscripts began at 18. However, Nicholas decided that all non-Orthodox conscripts could be conscripted from the age of 12. And from the age of 12, they would be taken to army schools where they would be educated as Russians from the age of 12 until they went into the proper army around 18. And he saw this as a tool for Russifying all of these non-Orthodox subjects, some of whom were Catholics, some of whom were Muslims, some of whom were Lutherans, and some of whom were, of course, Jews. And these were called canton schools. And thereafter, they served their 25 mandatory years. Now, we don't know exactly how many of these child conscripts lost their Judaism along the way. But we know for sure that a lot of them preserved their Jewish identity, and it was absolutely permitted in the Tsarist army to remain Jewish. We also know for sure that a lot of the Jewish soldiers who were discharged from the army after their 25 years of service, if they survived, of course, became very successful businessmen afterwards, wherever it was that they were discharged, usually along the peripheries of the Russian Empire. In total, about 40,000 Jewish boys were conscripted into the Tsarist army between 1827 and 1874. Okay, but by that time, by 1874, there are already, and that's a total of the course of almost 50 years, 40,000 boys. By this time, the Jewish population in the Russian Empire was somewhere around 3 million. So if you do the math, we understand that there were difficult points in this story, but it is not the catastrophe necessarily that that collective memory necessarily recalls. Now, the gentleman on the left next to Nicholas I is Crown Prince Alexander, who would very shortly thereafter, in 1854, become the Tsar of Russia. And Tsar Alexander is known as the liberator or the great reformer of Russia, because he, in fact, passes a series of reforms that changes Russia entirely. These reforms also had an impact on Russian Jewry because they provided, by emancipating the serfs and liberalizing Russia's legal system and its economy, these reforms have the effect of creating a market economy, and a little bit later on, an educational system, a true educational system, a legal profession, and industry. The Jews of Russia are poised really well to benefit from all of these reforms, and in fact, they do. So as their numbers are growing in the population, there's very, very quick Jewish reproductive cycles during this time. Jews are benefiting, I would say, disproportionately by the new opportunities offered by these very vast reforms. And I'll point out one. If we talked about the cantons before, we can talk about the military reform of 1874. It was one of the reforms of Tsar Alexander, 1874. This military reform, first of all, reduced military service immensely. So the most you could ever serve was 9 years. If you had education, much, much less than that. But more importantly, it opened up the officer corps to anyone. Until that time, until 1874, only people from the aristocracy, sons of the aristocracy, could become officers in the imperial army. Thereafter, anyone could. And we begin to see increasing numbers, and actually quite remarkable numbers, of Jewish officers in the Tsarist army. It sounds crazy, but it's true. Mostly concentrated disproportionately, again, in, this may or may not surprise us, in the medical corps, because of course every Jewish mother wants her son to be a doctor, but also in the artillery. Why in the artillery? Because artillery demands the ability to measure and to count and to calculate. And therefore, all of the benefits that Jews have been reaping by secular education in the Russian Empire after the reforms come to bear, amongst other things, in growing numbers of Jewish officers. In 1881, this same Tsar liberator was assassinated in 1881. He was assassinated by an underground terrorist organization called the People's Will, in translation from the Russian. This small terrorist organization had a disproportionate number of Jews who were members of it. As a result of that assassination, the Tsar was beloved. He was imperfect, but he was beloved by the common man in Russia. As a result of this of that assassination and the news getting out, pogroms were ignited in 1881 and 1882 and spread like wildfire in parts of in part of the Russian Empire. After the pogroms had been put down, a series of repressive laws called the May laws are passed, and they're entirely anti-Jewish. There are other laws that are passed that deal with the general population to put down any revolutionary spirit, but these May laws from 1882 to 1884 are really targeted towards Jews. In popular memory, the article that is most remembered is the numerus clausus, or the quota on Jewish education, because the Tsarist regime, like many other autocratic regimes, had come to the conclusion that higher education was a route towards radicalism. So if we keep the Jews out of higher education, or at least liberal studies, they'll be far less apt to become radicals. The pogroms and these restrictive laws bring a big change to Russian Jewry. It really is a watershed moment. Thereafter, migration begins en masse of Jews out of the Russian Empire. There are described political reasons. There are also economic reasons. As I said, the Pale was becoming increasingly overcrowded and impoverished because of that overcrowding. So Jews begin to migrate massively. Most of them come to the New World, meaning North America and South America. The much smaller parts of them emigrate to other places, amongst them Palestine. The second phenomenon that begins to happen at this watershed moment is a kind of politicization. Jews understand, those who remain in the Russian Empire, begin to understand that they have to start taking matters into their own hands. They can't trust the Russian regime to protect them, or the Russian army to protect them, so they have to begin to mobilize themselves. And they create or join a vast array of radical political movements. There's no political system yet in Russia, because it's an autocracy, but they can join radical underground movements. One of the people who joins, and next slide, please. One of the people who joins is someone that we're going to meet next week again, but I thought it would be a good idea to meet him first here. This is an arrest file of a Jew whose original name was Genoch Gershovitz. From 1912, arrest file from the Russian secret police. He was an anarchist, a socialist, a Bolshevik, and eventually, we'll see later on, he becomes head of the Soviet secret police. But he is fairly representative of the kinds of young people, young Jews, who gravitate towards radical movements in the underground and illegal. And the third phenomenon that begins to happen is that Jews, some Jews within the Russian Empire, begin to understand that they have to become a little less Jewish, a little less noteworthy for how they look, how they speak, and how they act. This will also prompt a fairly sizable migration, illegal, but nonetheless it happens outside of the outside of the Pale of Settlement towards other regions of Tsarist Russia. Next slide, please. The next stop on our very fast-moving train occurs in 1905. It has been forgotten over time, or mostly forgotten, but there actually was a revolution in Russia in 1905. Fascinating subject for study, but time is too short, of course, for us to really get into it. As you can see on the map on the left, there are a lot of large pogroms that occur in Russia between 1871, so even preceding the murder, the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, but going on until 1905, 1906. And on the right, we see victims of the pogrom in Odessa in 1905. If during the pogroms of 1882, around 70 total of 70 Jews were murdered, although there was massive damage and it was very, very scary, in 1905, we're already talking about thousands of Jews who are being murdered throughout the Pale of Settlement. But worse was still yet to come. These decades, around the turn of the 20th century, aside from these horrific events, they were also, and this is counterintuitive, witness to a slow, steady rise in the socioeconomic status of Russia's Jews and a truly remarkable flowering of Jewish culture in Yiddish, Hebrew, Russian, and Polish. Next slide, please. And here we see, it's a posed photograph, of course, some of the cornerstones of this silver age of Yiddish and Hebrew cultural production in Russia. This is in Odessa, the same place where you saw those murdered Jews laid out on the street. In that very same place, 5 years later, we find these the classic crew of Yiddish and Hebrew cultural production posing proudly in front of us. Second to the left is Shalom Aleichem, who is the author of Tevye, the dairyman, the same model for Tevye and all else. This flowering came in many, many forms, both in terms of literature, theater, the emergence of youth movements, as well as distinctly Jewish politics and labor movements. Next slide, please. And here we see a commemorative postcard that celebrates Jewish self-defense in Russia. This is way before anybody thought about the state of Israel, of course, because the Jewish Labor Bund, the Jewish Labor League, which was the largest voluntary organization in Eastern Europe at the time, Jewish, non-Jewish, anyone else, they organized in advance of the the revolution of 1905, self-defense units, which tried, for the most part unsuccessfully, to defend local Jewish communities in Eastern Europe against the violence. And these were three of the fallen members of that Bund. But at the same time, of course, this period coincides with the rise in the entrenchment of racial anti-Semitism, and we still feel the echoes today. Next slide, please. And the cornerstone of this was the publication, the production, the dreaming up, and the production of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which first saw the light of day in 1903. It was written originally, this story, this fictional conspiratorial story about Jews, wealthy Jews, the Rothschilds namely, influencing world finance and world leaders in order to take over the world. The protocols have had an extremely long shelf life, but again, they are a Russian invention in the cellars of the Russian secret police at the time. And for those of you who are wondering, the answer to your question is yes, this is the origin story of what we've been hearing about in the last few days. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene's conspiracy theories about Rothschilds and laser beams. This is the origin story, the protocols of the Elders of Zion. With all this in mind, let's drill down a little bit to what I'll call Anatevka, and that is the place where Tevye, for those of you who saw the movie or saw it on stage, his village. Next slide, please. This is a shot that we would find unsurprising. This is from what today is Belorussia, from the Vitebsk province, synagogue, a wood synagogue that was rebuilt just before the Second World War. And this, unsurprisingly, is kind of what we would imagine Tevye's world would look like, in part. In reality, this shtetl, this small Jewish town, almost always was no more than 1/2 Jewish. And from here, I'm going to want to contrast between real vintage photos and artistic impressions. So next slide, please. Here we see an artist's rendition by someone some of you may have heard of, Issachar Ber Ribak. He was a contemporary, as you can probably imagine, of Marc Chagall. He had the good fortune of dying young and in the Soviet Union, and therefore was not punished later on for some of the work that he did. In any case, he was a Ukrainian Jew who studied in Paris with Chagall, and you can see here a representation very much like what we saw in the photo, but there's a very important detail here. We see on the left a building that will be more, I suppose, surprising to some, which is a church. Because the Jewish shtetl, again, was never more than about 1/2 Jewish. Jews lived in that world in the shadow of, or alongside of Christians and Russian Orthodoxy. At core, the shtetl was a place of commerce between Jews and peasants and villagers who would come into town once or twice a week. Next slide, please. Once or twice a week, to trade with Jews who would then pass on those goods to larger so provincial markets. Here we see, again, this is part of an ethnographic collection of what a market would look like in Ukraine in 1912, 1914. This is, I guess, I would imagine the beginning of the market day, but here in a rather what we would say today, rather primitive place that is a shtetl. We would encounter it. Next slide. Again, an artist's rendition of this. And the third slide, please. A tailor from that same collection. And the next slide. Here we see, again, Ribak giving us artistic rendition of that same cobbler. A little more romantic, a little less gray overall. Now, when we look at all of these Jews, and now we're beginning to talk about fairly large numbers of them, by 1914, so the eve of the First World War, there are about 5.5 million Jews in the Russian Empire. That's an awfully big number. The shtetl is modernizing, but relatively slowly. But more and more of these Jews are moving to the cities, to the larger towns in the cities of the Russian Empire to seek out better futures. Now, Russian Jews were not entirely disempowered, as Fiddler on the Roof would have us believe. Next slide, please. And we'll have to move a little bit faster now to go through, but what we'll get here are images of empowered Jews who come together, and these are educated Jews who have created a kind of Jewish middle class for self-help. The OZE that we see on the left, these are people who come together, prominent Jews in Petersburg, so the capital of the Russian Empire, to form a Jewish welfare organization that assists nationally. On the right, we have Jewish lawyers and empowered rabbis who have come to the defense of Mendel Beilis, rather regular Ukrainian Jew who was accused of ritual murder in 1913, and they got him acquitted in a Russian court. And next slide, please. And here we have a poster from the Ort, which I would imagine some of you have heard of. The Ort, perhaps some of you have volunteered or contributed to the Ort. The Ort was created in the Russian Empire much, much earlier in 1880 amongst empowered Jews who wanted to promote, as we can see in the poster. The poster itself is from 1930 because the organization lasted that long, for vocational training of Jews throughout the empire. So from here, I'm afraid the news will begins to get worse, because in 1914, as some of us know, the First World War breaks out. And over the course of the First World War from 1914 until 1917, there's a great deal of Jewish suffering, mainly because most of the fighting of that war on the Eastern Front occurs in the Pale of Settlement. And it's a total war where the economy and pretty much all of the residential space is destroyed. And conquering armies also create a great deal of havoc. On top of that, about 500,000 Jews are expelled by the Russian Empire, the Russian army, to Siberia, or in the direction of Siberia. There's a great deal of death on the way and suffering, of course. All of this is then compounded because in 1917, as I mentioned before, next slide, please. In 1917, there is a revolution, and the revolution, which brings to power the new Bolshevik regime, the revolution causes a civil war. And this civil war, that again, for most people who are from outside of Russia, and even for some of those who are there, is largely forgotten. But millions will die in this civil war, and hundreds of thousands of Jews are victims of pogroms that occur at that time, between 1919 and 1921. So in 1921, next slide, please. Here we see some of the figures in this new Bolshevik regime. I've listed on the left, I couldn't identify everyone, but these are prominent leaders of the Bolshevik Party in Russia and in Europe. There is a massive disproportion here of Jewish leaders, some of whom are in Russia, some of whom are living abroad. And next slide, please. This is, again, an artist's rendition of the pogroms in Kiev, 1919. And next slide. And finally, we arrive at the Red Army Commissar, Leon Trotsky, Lev Bronstein, his original name, who is perhaps the most prominent Bolshevik of that time, exceeding even Lenin in his popularity in Russia. Here he's celebrated on a Soviet calendar. So this is about 2 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, in the midst of a civil war. For those of you who recognize it here, this is an iconic pose of Saint George, who is canonized in the Orthodox Church, but implanted instead of Saint George, Leon Trotsky the Jew. And Soviet citizens knew that he was a Jew, but he was the head of the Red Army at the time, and hence a hero within Soviet boundaries. So if we're poised in 1921, what's the condition? What's the status of Russian Jewry? They've arrived in a new world. They are now citizens, not subjects, citizens of a new regime. They've been emancipated by the Bolsheviks. In April 1918, the regime abolishes the Pale of Settlement. So they have both equal rights and freedom of movement wherever they choose to go. That's all of the good news. The bad news is that their former homes have been decimated by 7 years of almost continuous warfare, from the beginning of the First World War until the end of the Russian Civil War. Not only that, but the pogroms, the anti-Jewish pogroms of the Civil War, have traumatized almost the entire community. The good news from this is that during the Civil War, Jews learn that the only army, again, details perhaps in question and answer if there's time, details, the Red Army is the only fighting force that protects Jews during this horrific civil war. So Jews are standing now, Soviet Jews, and there are roughly 3 million Soviet Jews now in 1922, following the peace agreements that are reached with Germany to end the war. There are about 3 million Soviet Jews now standing on the precipice of an entirely new world that's never been tried before, this new Bolshevik world, with reasons for hope and an awful lot of trauma. So that's my presentation. Question and answers we'll leave, if there is time, for Professor Tinkoff to decide whether or not we have time for that.
We have a teeny bit of time. I hate not to have some questions. So first I wanted to say to everyone, I think what we'll do, Professor Descendants, if that's okay with you, we'll save the chat so that you can maybe respond and we can send it out to people for the questions that aren't answered.
Sure.
I want to say to everyone, it's a tour de force. You have to remember, you were just taken on the long 19th century from the end of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth into the creation of the Soviet Union. And as Professor Descendants, really magisтерiously showed you, it is incredibly complicated, and it's not the romantic suffering that has been embodied in Fiddler, which is great, and the Yiddish version was terrific. But Tevye's Descendants are much more complicated. So let me just ask one question that's come up, which I think will be interesting to many people, which is, what is the relationship, or was there a relationship, between the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which this false, libelous pamphlet, and the pogrom, which most people remember, the Kishinev pogrom of 1903, as opposed to the other incidences of anti-Jewish violence? What was the relationship between this text and this this pogrom, which became famous because of Bialik, the Hebrew poet?
Yeah. Look, I haven't studied the Kishinev pogrom. There's actually a fairly new book that just came out for those people who want to acquire it one way or another, by Stephen Zipperstein, that looks specifically at the pogrom in Kishinev in 1903, which was shocking to the world, that pogrom, because it was covered with photographs in real time. The first time ever that had happened, this kind of massacre in the world, covered by journalists in real time with photographs. To the best of my knowledge, there was not much influence of the protocols at that time, because they only appeared in France in 1903. Again, created by the Russian secret police, but floated in Paris, in France, in 1903. However, and the Kishinev pogrom is in 1903, so just not enough time. That being said, the horrific pogroms of the Civil War, 1919, 1920, 21, were absolutely fueled by the protocols. The white armies, those armies that were trying to bring down the Bolshevik regime, some of whom had invaded Russia, they all distributed freely copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It almost became like a kind of liturgy amongst the white armies to explain, why do we have to bring down this profoundly evil Jewish socialist regime? The protocols helped explain that, again, through this mythology of the world, the global world Jewish conspiracy, that sadly continues till today.
Right. So another question, which I think you can address probably quickly, is after World War I, the Civil War, and the Russo-Polish War, right? Again, I want to just commend you again, because I mean, this is like manna for me. 7 years of conflict, and Jews are caught in the middle between German armies, Russian armies, counter-revolutionaries, Polish liberators trying to resurrect Poland, and Jews are just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And you already emphasized this, Jews don't move that much. They're just where they've always been, and it's the wrong place at the wrong time. But how much do we know about immigration from Soviet Russia after World War I, sort of in this, not only the political conflict, but also, just the militarization? Where do these Russian, not yet Soviet Jews go? What do we know about those years?
Yeah, there is actually a heavy immigration of what are now going to be Soviet Jews out from around 1919 until 1924. They are allowed to leave by both the Tsarist and then the Soviet regime. They can leave. If they can get out, they can go wherever they want. And hence there's a massive influx of Russian and Polish speaking Jews to North and South America during those 5-ish years. There's also a major influx, again, much smaller numbers. We're talking about thousands and not hundreds of thousands. Thousands of these very same, or the neighbors of those who are going to North and South America and Australia and South America, South Africa are going to Palestine. They are by and large young people, the ones who are going to Palestine, highly motivated Zionists. And they are what is in fact a third aliyah, which is probably of all these waves of migration, early waves of migration into Palestine, is the most important in terms of founding the state, what will become the state eventually. That's when they leave. Everything stops in 1924 because the United States first, and then all other European, or almost all other European countries, close their gates to immigration. And hence the Jews can leave, but they can't go anywhere. And it becomes an ongoing crisis that, of course, bridges into the Nazi period, because it's the same problem in 1925 as it will be in 1935 when Jews are trying to get out of Nazi Germany, but they can't go anywhere. No one will let them in, or very few countries will let them in.
Okay, last question. You mentioned, and you gave us fascinating information about these early, very early agricultural colonies. They're not Zionist, but they're part of this move to productivization under Alexander I 1804 edict. Did they see conflict during World War I and the Civil War? Where was the Crimea in those years?
It's a good question. The early agricultural colonies are not in Crimea, they're in southern Ukraine. They haven't, Crimea comes later, but that's fine. They were devastated during the Civil War because in what is today's southern Ukraine, that area was one of the largest conflict zones of the Civil War. And of all the armies that were involved in that Civil War, the most anti-Semitic, the most violent was in fact not even an army. It was sort of a gang. It was called the Machno gang, sort of part of a peasant uprising. And they were concentrated there in southern Ukraine. Yeah. So there was a pretty heavy depopulation of these colonies during the Civil War, but they are repopulated, and we'll talk about that next week, how they become repopulated.
Right. Okay, well, I have personally tons of questions, but we'll do that in the virtual coffee hour that someday we'll be able to have again, right?
Right.
So I want to thank you so much, Professor Deckelchen, for really an incredible sweep with incredible images, and also helping our audience understand that much of what has been sacred mythology to them, understandably, you're allowed to have your feelings, is really not really comports with the history, including in particular this whole question of the induction of Jews into the Russian army. My own teacher helped publish a psalter, a psalm book, in both Russian and translated into English, which was for Jewish soldiers in the Russian army. So the idea that observing Jews would have a psalter, a psalm book for their service produced by the Russian government, tells you something about the complex relationship that the army had to Jews. So thank you so much. We'll save those questions for you. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll just add one thing. I mean,
sure.
I apologize to the audience, those of you who are out there. This must have seemed like you must be dizzy by this point, because we had to cover, in order to get to the Soviet period, had to cover an awful lot of ground. Time will slow down in the next two sessions, and so it'll be a little bit. It'll slow down. It'll be a little richer, and so if you could bear with me through this one, it will be, I think, a lighter experience in the next two sessions.
Well, that's all right. The great historian and writer Robert Caro has been quoted as saying, "Time is truth." So take your time. It's just fine with us. So I want to thank our audience, whom I can't see, but I know you're out there. And I want to thank the staff of the Bildner Center, without whom nothing can happen. The aide-de-camp, Karen Small, the managing director, keeps everything going and has kept everything going in this crisis of the pandemic. Jenny Gurman, the Senior Department and Center Administrator, Sarah Portilla, a Program Coordinator, our Administrative Assistant, Hannah Feldman. I want to thank them all. Really, there's so much behind the scenes prep that has to be done to produce everything we do. And I'm incredibly grateful for this team, which works nonstop to keep the programming as rich and professional as I think it has been, if I can say so. I want to alert you to the fact that you have 2 more sessions with Professor Jonathan Dekelchen the next 2 weeks moving forward. And if you have the links, you have the material if you want to read more. And I want to give you just a quick up-to-date about what else is coming up on our calendars. On February 11th, we have a film discussion with director Deborah Schaffer and pioneering artist Audrey Flack, based on the documentary Queen of Hearts, Audrey Flack. Audrey Flack was a feminist artist, a photorealist painter. It's a very, very interesting movie about a woman above and beyond her time. And I commend it to you, and it should be fantastic. It's sponsored with the Mason Gross School of the Arts, which I'm delighted is our partner in this. We have another mini course with another of our visiting scholars that will take place in March. It's called Jewish Countercultures, Remaking American Judaism, 1967 to 1990. You can register again on the website, and it will again be a 3-part series. 2 of my esteemed colleagues are doing book launch conversations. I couldn't be prouder. Professor Paula Tartikoff on her new book, Conversion, Circumcision, and Ritual Murder, A Medieval Mystery Unraveled, on March 3rd. Professor Jeffrey Chandler on his new book, Yiddish, Biography of a Language, on April 12th. Finally, well, actually not finally, March 7th, Rick Black, an artist from Highland Park, has done a marvelous artist book on the poetry of Yehuda Amichai. And 2 of my faculty colleagues, Azania Dean Israel and Gary Rensberg, were consultants to Rick on this gorgeous project. And we also are just nailing down finally a musical webinar with Anthony Russell, a bass singer who combines his African-American heritage and his serious study of Chazanut and Yiddish language in his musical oeuvre. So that's, hold on tight. That's what we have for you this spring. It will be warmer outside, but it's always warm in spirit. So thank you so much. Good night to you all. Stay safe, warm, and see you next week.